Dear Tim and Moby, the Vietnam War confuses me. What was it all about? From Ginny. That's a tough one. Let's start with the basics. Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia. In the 1800s, France took over control of Vietnam for its valuable exports, rice and rubber. Its neighbors, Laos and Cambodia, were also colonized by the French. Together, the three formed a single colony called French Indochina. The people of Vietnam didn't exactly appreciate being colonized. A lot of farmers lost their land and grew poor, while the French colonists grew rich. During World War II, a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh started organizing his Viet Minh armies against their French rulers. Then, in 1946, war broke out between the Viet Minh and the French. America's president, Harry S. Truman, decided to help France. Well, it's complicated. At the time, the U.S. was involved in the Cold War with communist countries like the Soviet Union and China. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and that worried Truman. See, American lawmakers believed that if Vietnam became communist, the rest of Asia would too. It was called the domino theory. At first, the U.S. gave the French money to help them win the war. But it didn't matter. The Viet Minh won victories in the north of the country. In 1954, France and the Viet Minh signed a treaty dividing the country into Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam. The government in the South wasn't very popular with its people. So the North Vietnamese used a transportation system called the Ho Chi Minh Trail to send soldiers and supplies to the communist uprising in the South. But the U.S. supported the South's anti-communist government with money and advisors. Then, on August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese boats fired torpedoes on an American ship patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It said the U.S. could use military force in Vietnam. At first, the force was limited to bombings. But by the end of 1965, there were 184,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and over 500,000 by the end of 1968. At first, everyone thought it would be an easy fight for the Americans. Their army was much more advanced and included a great navy and air force. Not only that, but a lot of battles were fought in the dense jungle. The U.S. Army was not equipped to fight this kind of war. But the Viet Cong, the communist soldiers in the South, fought a guerrilla war. They used small bands of soldiers to stage ambushes and built huge tunnel complexes to hide in. Even in the cities of the South, where Americans were in control, the Viet Cong would stage suicide bombings and sneak attacks. Back at home, the war became very unpopular. People couldn't understand why Americans had to die for a tiny country halfway around the world. Television, newspapers, and magazines brought home images of innocent Vietnamese civilians killed by American bombs. Protesters marched against the war, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. But a lot of Americans believed in the cause of the war. They thought the protesters were putting U.S. soldiers in danger by weakening support for them. Eventually, President Johnson stopped sending more troops. He even refused to run for another term as president because of Vietnam. Richard Nixon became president in 1968, promising to end the war with honor. But he didn't manage to make the peace until 1973, after his re-election. By the time the war was over, at least 1.2 million North and South Vietnamese were dead, and 58,000 American soldiers died in the conflict. Once the American army pulled out, the North Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is still mostly communist in its government, although it has shifted to a market economy where businesses and consumers decide what they want to sell and buy. And the U.S. and Vietnam are now friendly with each other. But the Vietnam War divided Americans sharply. After all these years, it can still be a touchy subject to bring up with people who lived through it. Ask your parents what they thought of the war, and read up on it to make up your own mind. Peace.